Eniton knelt by the water, filling her pot with cool, clear water. Her mind wandered as she worked, thinking about the many chores waiting for her at home. Suddenly, she heard rustling behind her. She turned and saw her dog, Bingo, walking toward her. Bingo, her old and loyal dog, was moving slowly, carrying something strange in his mouth. "What is that, Bingo?" she asked, standing up. Bingo came closer, and Eniton's eyes widened. In his mouth was a small, injured baby mermaid. Its tiny body looked weak, and its tail barely moved. "Wow, where did you find this?" Eniton whispered in surprise. Bingo carefully placed the baby mermaid on the ground near her. He wagged his tail as if proud of what he had done. Eniton quickly looked around and grabbed some herbal leaves from a nearby bush. She spread them on the ground and knelt down to check the mermaid. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'll help you." She chewed a few leaves, just like her late mother had taught her, and gently placed them on the mermaid's wounds. Her hands moved carefully, treating the baby with kindness. The baby mermaid made soft sounds, too weak to move much. Bingo sat beside Eniton, watching quietly with his old, kind eyes. A few minutes later, the river started to ripple. Eniton looked up, startled. Slowly, a beautiful figure rose from the water. It was a woman with golden hair and a glowing tail. She was the Mermaid Queen. "I have been searching for my baby," the Mermaid Queen said in a calm, clear voice. Eniton froze in shock. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you for saving her," the Queen said gently. "She is my daughter, and she means everything to me." Eniton carefully picked up the baby and handed her to the Mermaid Queen. The Queen took the baby into her arms. "Your kindness is rare," she said. "It will not be forgotten." Before Eniton could reply, the Mermaid Queen smiled and began to sink back into the water. Eniton didn't know that this small act of kindness will change your life forever. She knelt in tightly. "You did well, Bingo," she said, stroking his fur. Bingo wagged his tail slowly. He was an old dog, and his time was near. A few days later, Bingo passed on peacefully, leaving a deep hole in Eniton's heart. Even though he was gone, Bingo's love and loyalty lived on in her memories. Eniton was a lively and beautiful young girl. She had big dreams and always looked forward to a bright future. She once lived with her father, Mr. Deji, and her mother, Mrs. Kemi. But her family had a difficult past. Deji, her father, had 2 wives. Life wasn't easy for him, but he caused the trouble himself. Kemi was Deji's first wife. She loved him deeply, but when she was pregnant with Eniton, everything changed. Deji was not faithful. He often left Kemi at home and spent time with another woman, EJ. EJ knew Deji was married, but that didn't stop her. Deji also didn't stop. He continued seeing EJ until one day, EJ became pregnant. Although EJ looks bigger than her age, she's just a 19-year-old girl who still lives with her parents. When EJ started feeling very sick, her mother took her to the hospital. That was when they discovered she was carrying Deji's child. EJ's mother was furious. She couldn't believe her daughter was pregnant by a married man. The news spread quickly, and EJ's family was not happy. They demanded that Deji take responsibility. EJ was chased out of her parents' house. Deji had no choice. He had to marry EJ. When Kemi found out, she was heartbroken. She was angry with Deji, and they quarreled almost every night. The house was full of tension and sadness. Over time, Kemi decided to make peace. She knew she couldn't change what had happened. It wasn't easy, but she tried to accept the situation. She did her best to find happiness again. But deep down, Kemi's heart still ached. And the home, once filled with laughter, was now divided. Deji was not a rich man, but he worked hard to take care of his family. He tried his best to make both of his wives, Kemi and EJ, happy. But no matter how much he tried, things didn't go well for him. Kemi and EJ couldn't get along. They quarreled all the time. Even the smallest thing could spark a fight. If one said the soup was too salty, the other would say she cooked better. When they quarreled, it got loud. Kemi would point her finger at EJ and shout, "Husband snatcher." You knew he was married, but you still followed him. EJ wasn't the type to stay quiet. She would fire back. If you could satisfy him, he wouldn't have come to me. I only helped where you failed. Their fights always turned into a war of words. They would yell, insult, and blame each other until the whole neighborhood could hear them. People began talking about them, calling them the quarreling wives. Children in the street would sometimes gather to watch when the shouting started. Deji hated the fighting. He often sat with his head in his hands, wondering what to do. He would try to calm them down, but it never worked. The anger between Kemi and EJ was too deep. The home, once filled with laughter and peace, had become a place of noise and tension. Months passed, and Kemi gave birth to her first child, a beautiful baby girl named Eniton. Eniton was her mother's pride and joy. Not long after, EJ also gave birth to her first child, a baby girl named Chisara. With both children now in the house, the rivalry between Kemi and EJ grew even worse. Their hatred became sharper, their words more bitter. The children, innocent as they were, often found themselves caught in the middle, as they grew up. Soon enough, young Chisara started learning to hate from her mother. She soon developed hatred for Eniton. And for Eniton, growing up in the middle of it all, the constant fighting left her feeling torn and confused. Time passed and Kemi was ready to have another baby as Deji wanted a male child. That morning, Deji decided to drive Kemi to the hospital. Eniton stood at the door, waving goodbye. "Be careful, Papa," she called out. Kemi smiled weakly and waved back. But they never made it. On their way to the hospital, Deji and Kemi were involved in a terrible accident. Their car collided with a truck on the highway. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Both Kemi and her unborn baby were gone. Deji, too, did not survive the crash. The news hit Eniton like a thunderbolt. Her mother, her baby sibling, and her father, gone in one day. Her young heart shattered. The world she knew crumbled around her. The funeral was quiet, filled with sorrow. Eniton stood by the graves, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what would happen to her now. When the burial was over, she was told she had to live with her stepmother, EJ, the woman her mother had argued with so many times. They were worse than enemies. Eniton's stomach tightened with fear. How could she live with her mother's worst enemy? Would EJ treat her with kindness? Or would life in her stepmother's house become a new kind of nightmare? She clutched a small photo of her parents, their faces smiling back at her. "Mama," she whispered through tears, "how will I survive this?" Life with her stepmother, EJ, was nothing but pain for Eniton. EJ did not treat her like family. Instead, she took out all the anger she had for Kemi on Eniton. Every day, her words and actions were cruel. Sometimes, she even compared Eniton to a trash bin. EJ was brutal. She didn't allow Eniton to continue school. She told her, "I have the money for your schooling. I would rather burn it than spend it on a waste product like you." But she sent her own daughter, Chisara, to school without any problem. Eniton had a dog which her mother gifted her, but it passed on naturally. Eniton, now 13 years old, became the housemaid. She cleaned the house, fetched water, and even collected firewood from far-off places. When it was time to eat, Eniton was always the last. Most of the time, she only got leftovers. Sometimes, there was nothing left for her at all. Her stomach would rumble with hunger, but no one cared. Eniton missed her mother every single day. When the chores were done, she would sit under the old mango tree behind the house, her heart heavy with sadness. She would whisper to the wind, "Mama, why did you leave me? Why is my life like this?" No one came to comfort her. No one wiped her tears. She sat alone, clinging to the faint hope that someday, her life would get better. Years passed, and Eniton's suffering never seemed to end. She was now 21 years old, a young woman with a kind heart, despite all the pain life had thrown at her. Her days were filled with endless chores, but deep inside, she still held onto a small spark of hope that life could change. One morning, the town crier's voice echoed through the village streets. His drum boomed loudly as he called out, "Hear this! Hear this! Prince Adarimi, the handsome and noble son of our king, is ready for marriage." All the beautiful young women in the village must gather at the palace in 5 days' time. The news spread like wildfire. Every girl in the village was excited. Marrying the prince was a dream they had all held in their hearts. The palace was rich, the prince was kind, and being chosen as his wife would bring honor to any family. At home, EJ heard the announcement too. Her eyes lit up with a plan. She wanted her daughter, Chisara, to marry the prince. "Chisara is my girl," she said proudly. "The prince will surely choose her." EJ immediately began preparing Chisara. She made sure Chisara ate the best food, wore clean clothes, and practiced walking gracefully. EJ wanted her daughter to shine on the big day. When Eniton heard the news, her heart raced with excitement. She stopped scrubbing the floor and whispered to herself, "The prince is looking for a wife?" Her face lit up with a big smile. Though she had no fine clothes or special treatment, the thought of meeting the prince filled her with hope. She couldn't stop imagining herself as the prince's wife, living a life free of suffering. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream, as if the prince had already chosen her. But deep down, Eniton knew the challenges ahead. She glanced at her old dress. Would the palace even allow her in? Would the prince notice someone like her? Even so, she didn't let the doubts crush her hope. "Maybe," she whispered, clutching her chest, "just maybe, my life is about to change." For the next 5 days, the village buzzed with excitement. Girls braided their hair, polished their skin, and practiced curtsies. Meanwhile, Eniton worked harder than ever, wondering if she would have the courage to stand among them. Eniton's life was full of pain, but she had learned to endure it. Every day, she carried out endless tasks for her stepmother, EJ, and her stepsister, Chisara. Yet, deep in her heart, she was determined to go to the palace and meet the prince. One day, while fetching water from the stream, Eniton found a way to earn a little money. She noticed some girls in the village struggling to carry their water and firewood. Quietly, she offered to help them. In return, they gave her a few coins. It wasn't much, but she worked hard, helping more girls whenever she could. After days of sneaking around and working herself to exhaustion, Eniton finally saved enough money to buy a simple new dress. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and beautiful enough to wear to the palace. Back at home, EJ sat at the table with Chisara, enjoying a delicious meal. Meanwhile, Eniton had not eaten all day. "Where is that useless girl?" EJ shouted suddenly, her voice filled with anger. "Eniton!" Eniton quickly ran into the room, bowing her head. "Yes, Ma," she said softly. "Go to the stream and fetch water. Don't waste my time." EJ barked. "Yes, Ma," Eniton replied, her voice low and tired. As she turned to leave, Chisara smirked. "When you come back, don't forget to wash my dirty clothes," she added with a sneer. Eniton stopped and looked at her. Tears filled her eyes. She was older than Chisara, yet Chisara treated her like a servant. It hurt her deeply, but she said nothing. "Are you deaf?" EJ shouted again, her voice sharp and cruel. Eniton quickly wiped her tears and replied, "Yes, Ma. I will wash them." As she walked to the stream, her heart ached. She wondered if her mother could see her now, struggling to live in a house where no one loved her. But then, she thought about the new dress. She thought about the palace, the prince, and the chance to change her life forever. Eniton whispered to herself, "Just a little longer. I can endure this for a little longer." And with that, she wiped her tears, picked up her water jar, and walked toward the stream. On her way to the stream, Eniton walked slowly, her thoughts full of dreams. The path was quiet except for the rustling of leaves and the sound of her bare feet on the dusty ground. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, her heart skipped a beat. It was none other than the prince, Prince Adarimi himself. Eniton froze in shock. She quickly bowed her head. "Good afternoon, my prince," she said nervously. Prince Adarimi smiled and stopped a few steps away from her. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice calm and kind. "What is your name?" he asked, his eyes studying her. He could tell Eniton was blushing. "Eniton, my prince," she said softly, keeping her eyes on the ground. "Eniton," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful name." "What are you doing here alone?" "I'm fetching water, my prince," she answered, her voice steady despite her nervousness. The prince nodded, still looking at her. There was something about her, her simplicity, her gentle voice, and her quiet strength. "You are very beautiful," the prince said suddenly, his voice sincere. "I hope to see you at the palace when I'm choosing my wife." He asked her different questions, and she answered. Slowly, the prince began to like her. Eniton's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Thank you, my prince," she said, her voice trembling with joy. The prince smiled again before continuing on his way. Eniton stood frozen for a moment, watching him walk away. Then she let out a deep breath, her face breaking into a wide smile. She hurried to the stream, fetched the water, and returned home, her steps light with excitement. For the first time in years, she felt truly happy. Back at the house, Eniton worked with unusual energy. She swept the floors, washed the clothes, and even cleaned the kitchen with a smile on her face. EJ and Chisara noticed her sudden change. "What's wrong with her?" EJ asked, frowning. "She's never this happy." Chisara narrowed her eyes. "I don't know. Maybe she's gone mad." They both watched as Eniton hummed softly to herself, her joy impossible to hide. Neither of them could guess the truth, that a single encounter with the prince had given Eniton the hope she needed to keep going. The next day, Eniton went to the stream as usual. On her way back, her heart nearly stopped when she saw the prince again. He was standing by the path, as if waiting for her. "Good afternoon, Eniton," he said with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, my prince," she replied shyly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping to see you again," he said. "May I walk with you?" Eniton's heart raced. She nodded, unable to find the words to say. The guards helped her carry the water. They walked together, talking softly. As they approached the village, Eniton stopped suddenly. "My prince, please don't go any further," she said, her voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, surprised. She lowered her gaze. "Please, let me go from here." Eniton knew it wouldn't be good for her if her stepmother found out she had been seeing the prince. The prince looked at her for a moment and nodded. "Very well," he said. "But I hope to see you again." Eniton smiled softly. "Thank you, my prince," she said, bowing slightly. She turned and hurried down the path, her heart full of mixed emotions. What she didn't know was that Chisara had been hiding nearby. She had seen everything, the prince walking with Eniton, his warm smile, and the way he looked at her. Chisara quickly ran back home and burst into the house. "Mama," she shouted, her voice full of anger. "What is it, Chisara?" Chisara panted, trying to catch her breath. "I saw Eniton," she said. She was with the prince. He was walking with her and smiling at her. Ajay's hand froze. "What did you just say?" Chisara repeated. The prince was with her. He was smiling at her, "Mama." Ajay's face darkened. "Ah," she said slowly, her voice cold. "Now I see where her happiness is coming from." "So, she has been meeting with the prince." Chisara nodded eagerly. "Mama, we can't let her marry him. It should be me." EJ stood up, her mind already working on a plan. "Don't worry," she said, her voice sharp. "She must never marry the prince. Over my dead body will that happen." Chisara smirked, pleased with her mother's determination. Together, they began to plot against Eniton, unaware that fate had its own plans. EJ was furious. She couldn't stand the thought of Eniton marrying the prince. She quickly devised a wicked plan. She called 2 men from the village and offered them money to kidnap Eniton. "Take her far away," she instructed. "Keep her until after the prince chooses his wife. Then you can let her go." The men agreed. They waited for the perfect moment to strike. On the day of the plan, EJ sent Eniton to fetch firewood deep in the forest. "Don't waste time," she shouted as Eniton left. Eniton obediently went into the forest. She gathered as much wood as she could and tied it into a bundle. On her way back, she felt the road grow quiet. The birds stopped chirping, and the air felt heavy. Suddenly, 2 men jumped out from the bushes. They grabbed her arms roughly. Eniton screamed, dropping her bundle of firewood. "Let me go," she cried, struggling against their grip. But just then, the sound of approaching footsteps and voices filled the air. The men froze. The prince and his guards appeared on the road, walking toward them. "Who are you?" one of the guards shouted, drawing his sword. The men panicked. They let go of Eniton and bolted into the forest without a word. The prince ran up to Eniton. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Eniton nodded, trembling. "Yes, my prince. Thank you." The prince looked around, his brows furrowed. "You must be careful when passing this road," he said gently, "especially at odd hours." "I will, my prince," Eniton said, her voice soft but grateful. The prince motioned to one of his guards. "Help her carry the firewood," he ordered. The guard lifted the heavy bundle onto his shoulder and walked with Eniton toward her house. As they approached, EJ watched from the doorway with shock on her face. She quickly forced a smile and pretended to be busy when Eniton arrived. "Thank you," Eniton said to the guard, bowing slightly. "I'm very grateful." The guard nodded and left with the prince. As soon as they were gone, EJ clenched her fists, anger burning in her chest. Her plan had failed, and the prince had saved Eniton once again. She knew she had to think of another way to stop her. When Eniton arrived home, she was surprised to find EJ and Chisara waiting for her. Their faces showed a mix of shock and anger. "You're back?" EJ said sharply, her eyes narrowing. Eniton nodded timidly, unsure of why her return made them so upset. She didn't know about their failed plan to keep her away from the prince. EJ clenched her fists. Her plan had failed, and now, with only 2 days left until the event at the palace, her anger boiled over. The next day, Eniton quietly prepared her best dress for the big day. It wasn't new or shiny, but it was neat and presentable. It was the dress she had worked so hard to buy. She carefully laid it out on her mat, feeling a small sense of hope. But EJ saw the dress and immediately accused Eniton of stealing money to buy it. "So, you started stealing from me, haven't you?" she shouted. Without waiting for a response, EJ grabbed the dress and threw it into the fire. "No!" Eniton screamed, rushing forward, but it was too late. The flames consumed the dress quickly. Chisara joined in, smirking as she packed all of Eniton's clothes and tossed them into the fire as well. "This will teach you a lesson," EJ said coldly. Eniton stood there, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe it. The dress she had worked so hard to buy, the one thing that gave her hope, was gone. She was left with nothing but the dirty, smelly rags she wore to fetch firewood. As if that wasn't enough, EJ forbade her from leaving the house. "You will not fetch firewood or water anymore," she said, her voice harsh. "I don't want you meeting that prince again." Heartbroken and trapped, Eniton sat in her room crying. She couldn't see any way out. The event was just a day away, and she had no dress, no way to leave the house, and no one to help her. Eniton felt as if all her hopes had been burned away. The big day finally arrived, and the whole village buzzed with excitement. Eniton sat quietly in a corner, watching EJ and Chisara prepare for the event. EJ brought out her finest jewelry and helped Chisara put on a shimmering dress. She adjusted Chisara's headpiece, smiling proudly. "You look perfect," EJ said, admiring her daughter. "The prince will surely choose you." Chisara grinned and twirled in front of the mirror, full of confidence. Eniton sat silently, her heart heavy with despair. She knew that if Chisara married the prince, EJ's power over her would grow stronger. She would use that power to keep Eniton frustrated forever. She watched as they left the house, Chisara walking confidently while EJ beamed with pride. The door slammed shut behind them, and Eniton was left alone. She looked down at herself, wearing the dirty rags EJ had left her with. Her dreams of a better life felt so far away. But deep inside, a spark of determination flared. "No," she whispered to herself. "I can't just sit here. I have to try." With no other option, Eniton decided to go to the palace dressed in the rags. She knew it wasn't proper, but she had to take the chance. When she arrived at the palace gates, the sight before her was overwhelming. Beautiful young women in dazzling clothes lined up, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Everyone stared at her, wondering why someone so poorly dressed would even think of coming. But when Eniton stepped forward, the guards at the entrance stopped her immediately. "Where do you think you're going?" one of them asked, his tone sharp. "I'm here for the prince," Eniton said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. The guards looked her up and down, their faces filled with disgust. "Dressed like this?" one guard scoffed. "You look like a mad woman. Turn around and leave." Eniton's cheeks burned with shame, but she tried to explain. "Please, I have a special invitation from the prince. He asked me to come." The guards exchanged glances and laughed. "A special invitation?" one of them mocked. "The prince would never invite someone dressed like you. Go home." Eniton's heart sank. She tried again, pleading with them. "Please, just tell him Eniton is here. He will understand." But the guards weren't ready to listen. They waved her off dismissively. "Leave immediately," one of them said sternly. Tears filled Eniton's eyes as she turned away. The heavy gates of the palace stood tall behind her, shutting out her hopes. She walked back down the path, her heart shattered. The grand event began with music and excitement. The palace courtyard was filled with beautiful girls from the village, all dressed in their finest. The air buzzed with whispers and laughter as they waited for the prince to arrive. EJ stood proudly near the front, her hand firmly on Chisara's shoulder. "Smile," she whispered to her daughter. "Make sure he notices you." Chisara obeyed, smiling brightly as she adjusted her jewelry and dress. She looked at the prince with confidence, believing she would be his choice. The prince entered the courtyard, dressed in royal attire, his face calm but his eyes searching. He scanned the crowd, looking for someone. But she wasn't there. The prince's heart sank. He couldn't see Eniton anywhere. He remembered her gentle smile, her kind eyes, and the way her presence had warmed him. He had hoped to see her standing there among the other girls. The king, sitting on his throne, noticed the prince's hesitation. "Son," he said firmly, "you must choose. Time is running out." The prince nodded but didn't move. He kept searching the crowd, hoping Eniton might appear at the last moment. The king frowned and looked at the large clock in the courtyard. "You know the rules," he reminded the prince. "If you don't choose a wife before midnight, you will lose your right to the throne." This was the tradition passed down through generations. Every prince had to marry before his 29th birthday to secure his place as the next king. Prince Adarimi's 29th birthday was only hours away. The prince looked at the king and nodded, but his heart was heavy. How could he choose a wife from these girls when the one he truly wanted wasn't there? EJ noticed the prince's hesitation and pushed Chisara forward. "My prince," she said loudly, "this is my daughter, Chisara. She is beautiful, well-behaved, and will make a wonderful queen." Chisara curtsied gracefully and smiled at the prince. The prince gave her a polite nod but quickly looked away. His mind was elsewhere. The king sighed impatiently. "Adarimi," he said sharply, "you must make a choice. The people are waiting, and time is not on your side." The prince's heart raced. The clock ticked louder in his mind. He couldn't delay much longer. If he didn't choose soon, everything he had worked for, his future as king, would be lost. But how could he marry someone else when his heart belonged to Eniton? He kept glancing toward the entrance, hoping against hope that she would come. But with every passing moment, his hope dimmed. The king leaned forward, his voice firm. "Choose, son. The next king must not delay." The prince clenched his fists, his worry growing. He had only a few hours left. If Eniton didn't come soon, he would have to make a choice that could change his life forever. Meanwhile, Eniton sat by the river crying. The moonlight reflected on the water as she sank to her knees at the riverbank. She felt lost and hopeless, as though every effort she had made was in vain. "I've lost everything," Eniton whispered, her voice breaking. "I worked so hard, and now I have nothing. The prince will choose someone else, and I will be stuck in this misery forever." She buried her face in her hands and sobbed uncontrollably, her cries echoing through the quiet night. The sound traveled far, drawing the attention of someone unexpected. The water began to ripple, and from the depths, a graceful figure emerged, a woman with glowing scales, her hair flowing like liquid gold. It was the Mermaid Queen, a powerful yet kind-hearted being who ruled the waters. She was drawn by the sound of Eniton's sorrow. She immediately recognized her as the one who saved her baby long ago. The Mermaid Queen approached silently, her voice soft and soothing. "Child, why are you crying?" Eniton looked up, startled, her tears glistening on her cheeks. Who are you? It has been long. I see you can barely remember me. It's time for me to pay you back for the good you once did for me. I am the Queen of the River, the mermaid replied, her voice calm. Your tears reached me, and I felt your pain. Tell me, what troubles you? Through her sobs, Eniton explained everything, the cruelty of her stepmother, the burning of her dress, the guard's rejection at the palace, and how she had no way to meet the prince. The Mermaid Queen listened carefully, her face full of sympathy. You have suffered greatly, my child, she said. But your kind heart and pure soul deserve a chance. The mermaid dove back into the river. Wait here, she called. Moments later, she emerged holding a stunning, radiant dress. It sparkled in the moonlight, adorned with tiny crystals that looked like drops of water frozen in time. This dress, the Mermaid Queen said, will make you shine brighter than the stars. But that is not all. Eniton washed herself by the river before putting on the dress. The mermaid helped her with her makeup, dressing her like a princess. Tears of gratitude streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. The Mermaid Queen smiled warmly. Your gratitude is enough. Now go, you have a destiny to fulfill. The prince is waiting. With renewed hope, Eniton stood tall. She began her journey back to the palace, her heart racing with anticipation. The tension in the palace was unbearable. The king sat on his grand throne, his face stern as he looked at the large clock on the wall. Adarimi, he said, his voice firm, you must choose now. These are all the maidens in the village. If you don't pick one in the next 5 minutes, you'll lose your chance to become king. The prince stood in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by the beautiful maidens in the village. They were dressed in their finest, smiling and hopeful. But his heart wasn't in it. He glanced at the entrance once more, his eyes searching desperately. Where was she? Had she given up? Meanwhile, Eniton was rushing toward the palace, her heart pounding. Her shimmering dress sparkled under the moonlight, and her beauty radiated with an almost otherworldly glow. As she approached the palace gates, the guards immediately stepped aside, bowing to her. They didn't realize it was the same girl they had stopped earlier. Eniton's transformation was breathtaking. Time was running out, the king shouted to the priest. Wed him to anyone. He had 28 years to carefully pick his wife. It's too late now. She entered the grand hall, and suddenly, all eyes turned to her. The room fell silent. Her scent, sweet and divine, filled the air. Her presence commanded attention. The Mermaid Queen's magic had made her glow with a beauty that seemed almost ethereal. The prince's heart skipped a beat. He knew instantly it was her. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his face lighting up with joy. Eniton, he said, his voice filled with relief and happiness. He reached out his hand and guided her to the center of the hall. This is the one I choose, the prince announced proudly. This is my wife. Cheers erupted in the hall. The king smiled, nodding his approval. You have made your choice just in time, my son. It was worth the wait, he said, smiling. The royal priest stepped forward, and before the clock struck midnight, the prince and Eniton were joined together as husband and wife. The celebration that followed was grand. The palace was filled with music, laughter, and joy. Tables overflowed with food and drinks, and everyone left with gifts and presents. Even the maidens who weren't chosen left with full stomachs and smiles on their faces. But not everyone was happy. EJ and Chisara stood in a corner, their faces dark with disappointment. Their plan had failed, and they left the palace quietly, humiliated and defeated. As the night wore on, Eniton stood beside the prince, her heart filled with gratitude. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free and deeply loved. Days later, EJ and Chisara, filled with regret, came to the palace. Their faces were filled with shame as they knelt before Eniton. "We are sorry for all we did to you," EJ said, her voice trembling. "Please forgive us. Let us stay here with you." Chisara added, "We have learned from our mistakes. Please give us a chance." Eniton listened calmly but didn't speak. She turned to the prince and shared everything, her years of suffering, the cruel treatment. The prince frowned deeply. He whispered to Eniton, "It is best they return to their home. Their presence may harm your peace. They may get jealous later on." Eniton nodded, understanding. She told them she had forgiven them but respectfully dismissed them. EJ and Chisara bowed their heads, tears streaming down their faces. They left the palace, filled with regret and sorrow, knowing they had lost their chance at a better life because of their actions. Years passed, and under Prince Adarimi's reign, the kingdom flourished. He was crowned king, and Eniton, his beloved wife, was crowned queen. Their love for each other brought peace and prosperity to the land. Soon, the palace echoed with laughter again when they welcomed their first child, a beautiful baby girl with her mother's kind eyes and her father's strength. Eniton's story, once filled with pain and struggle, became a tale of hope, love, and triumph. She lived happily, surrounded by the love she had always dreamed of. Destiny can be delayed but cannot be denied. No matter the obstacles or challenges placed in your path, what is meant for you will always find its way to you, proving that no one can stop what is divinely meant to be.
하지 가르치면 되지 왜 들으려고 그래. 나 죽는 거지. 언제 안 잡겠냐 옛날 너 언제 온다는데.
아, 깜빡한 게 존나 쉬워 보이고. 야! 야! 중국아 시키느냐? 중국아! 야! 중국아 시켜! 거기 만지지 마! 아니, 까부다! 야, 누가 만져! 중국아 시키느냐? 어?
내려갑니다. 문이 닫힙니다. 에코입니다.
여자친구. 아 왜?
누군데?
여자친구라니까.
네 여자친구 어디 있어 또? 왜?
깨잖아.
아니 파.
왜?
아니
나는 왜?
여자친구 왜 방에 자고 있는데?
여자친구는 내 방에.
네 여자친구 씨발 잔다 소리도 안 했잖아.
아니 뭐내 집에 내 여자친구 들어온 게 뭐가 잘못된?
대신. 아이고
왜 그런데?
자수 네 말도 안 하고 엄마한테 얘기도 안 하고 이하고 친구하고 데리고 안 하고 이하고 누워 있어. 아이고
뭐 잘못됐나?
잘 됐나 그럼?
왜?
잘 됐. 잘 됐나?
괜찮아. 왜? 여자친구 만들어놓은 왜 만들었잖아. 여기 자고 있잖아.
여자친구 만들어 개친구까지. 저.
나 진정해봐라. 앉아. 그러니까 뭐가 잘못된 거야? 여자친구를 만들어 잘못된 거야? 집에 와서 잘못된 거야?
여자친구를 만들어갖고 만드는 건 당연한데 어제부터 있었다고 옆에 와갖고 지금 집에 와갖고 하고 자고 있는 거 같이 누워 있는데 여기 왜 너 집이고 엄마 집이지? 엄마한테 허락 안 받고 데리고 와고 하고 집에 누웠는데 저 집에 없나? 여자친구는 그럴 거면 여자친구 집에서 나가라 시켜.
아니 잠깐만. 아니 엄마 그러면은 허락 안 받아가지고 지금 화가 난 거야? 내가 여자친구랑 자서 화가 난 건 알지?
다 하졌지 진짜 엄마한테 인사도 안 시키고 엄마한테 말도 없이 갑자기 친구하고 옆에 자는 게 어디 있노?
아 그럼 내가 여자친구 소개시켜줄게. 잠깐만.
아 됐다.
있어봐라.
아 뭐 어디 있어봐야지 뭐.
자기야 좀 일어나봐. 자기야.
안녕하세요. 코니 여자친구 코니입니다.